Hi everyone, today I am coming with a video on how I made McCall's 6972. This is a men's shirt pattern and I've used this to make a lot of my husband's shirts. Recently he made his own, but I have a couple more to make and I wanted to show you how I went about and did the shirt. So the first thing I want to show you is what I like about this pattern. So this was the first shirt that I made for my husband some years ago, and this is not the McCall's pattern. This is actually just my own that I made from one of his shirts, and I turned it in. This is probably like 2 inches, I think. But what I don't like about this pattern is when it's all buttoned, and you break the lapel, you see the wrong side of the fabric. That's what I want to say. Yeah, you see the wrong side of the fabric, and I don't like that. So in the shirt that he just made, which is the McCall's pattern, it has this nice wide facing that you attach. That way when you button the shirt, you don't see any of the wrong side of the fabric. So that is what I like about this pattern. The collar on this pattern is just your basic collar. There is no collar stand, which you get in shirts. This shirt is one we bought when we were on vacation in Trinidad. And so this is your collar stand and this is your collar. So this is a 2-piece collar. And you get this in more dressy shirts. But that's not the collar in this pattern. So we're just going to go ahead and work with this. So again, it's McCall 6972. I have all my pieces cut out already. I have the facing cut. I have attached my interfacing to here. It's press-on interfacing. So I have already cut and attached those. I have serged my edges. This is the collar. My interfacing is already attached. So you can go ahead and do that. And the next step would be to sew your shoulder seams together. So this is the back of the shirt. You want to line up your shoulders. And you want to go sew your seam. I think it's 5/8 seam allowance. So you want to go sew that on both sides and serge your edges. And then I will come back and show you how we do the collar. Okay, so my collar is sewn. It's probably difficult for you guys to see because it's white thread and this is a pretty light fabric. So now I trim the edges and then I go in a little bit closer at the corner. You want to reinforce the corners when you're stitching it. just so that it doesn't come undone when you're trimming really close to the edge. And you don't want a lot of fabric in the corner of your collar when you turn it, because then it's gonna look very bulky and not neat. So my notches, I just snip to the thread, if my scissors would actually work, and maybe every inch or so I just put a cut in the fabric. You could see, I hope you can see. I just put a snip every inch or so. Then I trim it down. I trim down 1/4 of an inch. And what I like to do is open the collar and put a stay stitch, which is just a straight stitch. And I put it on the side that has the interfacing, because this is the side that's going to be under. Let me show it to you. So once you turn your collar over, this is your interface side. This is the side that's going to be closest to the neck. And then when your collar breaks, that's how, this is just my rough idea of how it's going to look. So I always put my stay stitch, which is a big, maybe 4 millimeter length stitch, on this side of the fabric, the side that has the interfacing. So I'm gonna go do my notches, trim, put the stay stitch in, and then I will come and show you how I do the pockets. Okay guys, my collar is sewn. My understitching is just done on this part of the collar. And now I'm just going to set that aside for a bit and go to the pocket, because I like to get the pockets in place before I add the collar on, because I like this piece to be flat while I'm doing it. So as you can see, this is my pocket that's cut and prepared. When I say prepared, the 1 inch turn is already serged on the edge and stitched, and I have ironed 1/2 inch all the way around. When you're cutting your pocket, if you're dealing with a pattern fabric, you gotta make sure that your pattern matches, because you know how it's gonna look if it's not. And so this is where I wanted it to be. Now I have to make sure that when I stitch my pocket in place, it's lined up with the pattern. So if your pocket has a pattern that has to be matched, you can go ahead and do that. If it doesn't, go ahead and stitch it where the mark is, where you should be sewing your pocket. What I do is I start stitching from that line, that hemline that I made. I start stitching from there. I go up to the edge of the pocket, I go across, and then I go down all the way around and back up here this way and that way, just to give it some reinforcement so that when you're constantly using the pocket, it doesn't rip. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll get into attaching the collar to the neckline. I wanted to give you a close-up of the pocket. So this is how my pocket looks after being sewn. If you see the white thread there. So you try to stitch it as close as the edge of the pocket as you can, That way it will look much more professional. And like I said, I started here, so maybe like ½ inch in. I started here, I did a little back tack, I went up, I went across the top of the pocket, because this is the top of the pocket right here. I went across, and then you go down as close to the edge as you can, and across the bottom, up, across here, and then back down and do a little tap, and that's your pocket. Okay, now we're going to install the collar. I know collars can be intimidating, so I'm going to try to show you this as slowly, and I'm going to try and explain it as best as I can. So now that your collar is constructed, you basically have a good side and a bad side, or you want to say the outer collar and the inner collar. So I like the piece that has no interfacing to be my outer collar, meaning that when the collar breaks, that's the side that I like showing, not the interface side. The interface piece is the piece I attach to the neckline. So you want to get the middle of your collar, it should have a notch, and you want to attach it to the notch on your shirt. So I go ahead and I pin that, and then you should have a notch over here where the end of your collar goes. So I pin that in place, and then I do the same thing on the other side at the little notch there. It's just over 2 inches from the edge of your shirt front. So I pin that into place, and you could already see that it's starting to line up with your neckline. Now I want to separate the collar, and I just want to put a pin where that shoulder seam is that we stitched earlier and we ironed it backward. I just want to pin that part to the collar. So I want to pin the shoulder seam to the collar that has the interfacing on it, not the other piece. And I want to do the same thing on the other shoulder seam. So now you can see my collar is fully pinned to my neckline. The next step now is to attach your interfacing. So I have a little trick that I do. Because the facing has interfacing, it is not as flexible as it was before there was interfacing on it. So I do little notches. Again, it can't be a lot, so maybe 3/8 of an inch. And what I do is, this is your shoulder seam. This is going to be attached to your shoulder seam in the end. So 2 inches down from here, I do my first notch. There. And then maybe every 3/4 of an inch, I do notches. Don't go too deep, because remember, you have to sew 1/2 an inch or 5/8 of an inch. So you don't want your notches to be too deep. That way, I can get the flexibility I need to attach this to my neckline. Okay, so your first facing is going to go this way. So remember, this short end here is your shoulder seam. You want to line it up with the shoulder seam on your shirt. I'm going to pin it and then I'm going to zoom in for you to see. Now you're pinning through all the layers. Your facing, your shirt collar, and your shirt. And you want to get this edge of your facing with the edge of your shirt. Now you could already see it's forming a little, it's kind of resisting. This is where I find putting the notches before would help with the flexibility. And then you could pin all the way down to the hem of your shirt. Then you want to do the same thing on the other side. So this facing is lining up with the edge of your shoulder seam on your shirt. Pin it in place through all layers. Pin it to the edge of your shirt. And pin it all the way down to your hemline. Then I'm going to zoom in and show you exactly how this looks. Okay, so I zoomed in. So again, this is the short edge of your facing that is lined up with the shoulder seam at your neckline. So remember, our first notch was 2 inches from here. This is our first notch. What you're going to do now that everything is pinned into place, you're going to start stitching. I put a pink mark so you can see. You're going to start stitching from the first notch and stitch all the way to the edge here. It's a 1/2 inch seam. Then you're going to reinforce that corner right here and then stitch all the way down to the hem of your shirt. That's what you're going to do. Again, from here, make sure you back stitch and a 1/2 inch seam all the way down to the corner. Reinforce that corner and then stitch all the way down your 1/2 inch seam down to the hem of your shirt. You're going to do that for both facings. So on the other side, again, you're going to start from this notch that is 2 inches away from here, and you're going to stitch this way, reinforce your corners, and stitch all the way down to your hemline. Then I'm going to come back and show you the other part of the collar. Okay, we're coming along. So I have sewn from my 2 inch notch here all the way to the corner and all the way down. I've done the same thing on the other side. From my 2 inch notch to the corner, down the side. But you still have this piece here that needs to be attached to the neckline, and somehow my pin fell out. So this might be tricky. So as you see, I took the pin out from there. But this, remember when we pinned this shoulder seam to the collar piece that has the interfacing? You still want to have that there, because now you're going inside, and where your stitch started here at the notch, you want to go inside and line that up right there. Where's my marker? You want to start stitching right there, 1/2 inch, just the side that's interfaced and your neckline. Make sure your seam is going this way for this shoulder seam, and on this side it has to go that way. So you're stitching 1/2 inch all the way across to this point where the notch is, where you started stitching this point at the facing. That is what you're doing. And then your next step, make sure you put your little back tack stitches on both sides. And then your next step is to sew these two pieces together. Again, start where the notch begins and go this way, 1/2 inch. So you're stitching your facing to the collar side that doesn't have interfacing, and you're going to do it on both sides too. So this side and that side, 1/2 inch, and inside here 1/2 inch, and then we'll almost be finished with the collar. I'll just show you the last step of the collar. If you have labels, I would show you when I attach my labels. So I figured I would bring the camera to the machine so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. So this is the facing, and this is the collar that is not interfaced. So you want to get that out of the way, and you want to go in there. You're going to be able to see the stitch that you did on the outside that you did before. So you want to go in there and line your needle up exactly where that stopped, and stitch the collar piece that's interfaced to your neckline, and you're stitching 1/2 inch. So I am going ahead and doing that, making sure to go back, and it's a 1/2 inch seam all the way across. Make sure your shoulder seam is nice and flat. You're going all the way across to the other point, and you want to back stitch there and cut your thread. So now your collar is attached to your neckline. You can see it right there. And now the next thing you want to do is, you might have to flip it over. You want to take this little facing piece, and the collar piece that is not interfaced, you want to just stitch those two pieces together. Again, starting from the stitch where you stopped before earlier, where that 2 inch, that first notch at 2 inches was. I hope you guys could understand this. And you're gonna do the same on the other side. It's just happened seam, so one thing to make sure before you cut anything, make sure your collar make sure they're the same on both sides before you cut anything off. And when I say cut anything off, I mean trim seams. So what I do is I get the two ends of the collar and I match them up to make sure they're the same. Okay, let's go back to the table and then I would show you what it looks like. Okay, so our facings should look like this. At this point, everything is attached. Your facing, your shirt, and the collar in between. And then from your 2-inch point, it should look like this. So this should still be open. Up to here and up to here. So what you need to go and do now is that same notch at 2 inches, you need to snip through all layers of your fabric. Do not cut your stitch because you would regret it. And you need to do the same thing on the other side. Snip to your stitch line. Remember all that back stitch that you did before? It's gonna come in handy now. Then all those snips that we did before we added the facing, you just want to go and at that point snip through all your layers. My scissors doesn't want to snip today, so this will help your collar to sit nicely. Again, make sure that your collar is the same length on both ends. By doing this, just take a quick turn it over and line it up like this. Make sure it's even on both sides. You want to trim the corners here. It's basically the same thing. It is the same thing on both sides. Snip through all layers here. And then open this up and you want to snip the collar with the interfacing and the neckline of the shirt. This is where you want to snip. Make sure your shirt is not in the way and you don't cut through it, because this is like the hardest part of a shirt for me. For me, this part takes the longest. After this, it's like super quick. It's just the sleeve and your side seams. I definitely need to sharpen my scissors. All this snipping is so that your shirt can lay, your collar can lay flat. Okay. So now that you have all your snipping and stuff done, this part, this is the back of your shirt, this is the neckline, you want it to go inside. So what's gonna happen is, at this point where we made that notch at 2 inches, from that point, everything is gonna go up into the collar. And here where we stitch the face into the shirt, that is also gonna go up into the collar. So both of these are gonna go up into the collar, and all of these are just gonna stay like that, and we're gonna trim it off after. So let me get my label and some pins and I'll be right back. Alright, so I would advise, if you've never done this before, you should probably get your basting thread out. I would also advise, if you've never sewn a shirt before, it's probably best to do it with like a cotton fabric, nothing that is too you know, like chiffon. I know you wouldn't make a man's shirt out of chiffon, hopefully, but that quality type material. Like, I personally don't pay attention to material when I buy it, so I really cannot tell you what this material is made up of, but I can tell you it's very I want to say shifty, if that's a word, but that's just how this fabric is. So if you follow what I did, again, everything went up inside there, and then this part of the collar I turned in like 1/2 inch, and I'm just pinning it just below the stitch line. At this point is when I'm going to put my label in here. So like I was saying, for those who have never made a shirt or attached a collar before, it's probably a good idea for you to go in and baste stitch this, because what's going to happen is when you go to your machine, you're stitching in the ditch right here and hope that you catch right here. So to be safe, it's better to baste it first. I've done this like a lot of times, so I just wing it like I do a lot of projects. And I put my label in right there. So I am going to sew that and I'll be back. One quick thing before you actually sew it on, which I didn't mention, you want to start stitching at your 2-inch notch, which is now on the inside. You can't see that anymore because you turned it in. You want to start stitching there, and you're stitching on this side of the shirt, but you can feel it. Like, I can actually feel here where that 2-inch notch that I made, and you're stitching in the ditch all the way across to the other point where you made that notch at 2 inches, all along in the ditch, making sure that you catch your collar under here. And I sewed my label in, I just tacked it in, so when I stitch my collar, it's gonna be in there. Alright, my collar is attached. Hope you can see my stitch there. Now I'm gonna raise this. So this is how your inside should look. That's the 2-inch, first the notch at 2 inches that we made in the beginning, and then we started stitching that way. So like I said, that should be inside your collar. Now I'm going to trim this down a little. trim your corners. Don't forget to reinforce your corners, because when you're trimming so close to the edge, it can come loose. Your next step is to just take this facing and tack it to the shoulder seam. Not the actual shirt, just the seam. Just put a little tack there on both sides to keep that in place. After that, what you want to do, you want to understitch your facing. So I think in my husband's shirt, I go down about, let's see, about 3.5 inches down, and I make a notch there, and I'm going to show you why. So from the top there, I make a notch at 3.5, and the reason why I do this, I do it on both sides, because this is where the button and buttonhole is going to start. And when I'm doing my understitching, I don't want to go all the way to the top, because that stitch is going to show when he buttons his shirt and he opens it like this. So this notch just tells me where to stop the understitching. So my notch is at 3.5, and I'm going to open this flat. I'm going to stitch down all the way to the hem with, again, like a nice length stitch, maybe 4 inches or whatever. So I'm just going to do that all the way down on both sides, and I'm going to attach my facing to my shoulder seam, and the next step is to put the sleeve on and the side seams. Alright, the hard part is over. So at this point, you should have your collar, your facing sewn and flat stitch. When you're flat stitching, it's just this side, you're not sewing it to this side, so it should be able to do that. This is how it should look at this point. All your facing at your collar is in nice and neat. Your facing is attached to your shoulder seam on both sides. And now we're going to add the sleeve. Easy peasy. This is not a set-in sleeve. So you get your center. I am bad with notches, guys, so bear with me. I usually don't mark notches when I've cut a pattern out, so because I just don't. There's no particular reason. So you just want to get the center of your sleeve with your shoulder seam. I would pin it in place, and all you gotta do is get the edge of your sleeve here, line it up with the edge, the side seam of your shirt, and you're just going to your machine and stitch all the way to the other side seam. You're doing that on both sides of your shirt, and I will come back and show you how that looks. So sew your side seam. It's 5/8, I think, according to the pattern. I usually do 1/2 inch. It's not a big deal. And I serge my seams, and then I do my side seams, but I'll show you how that is done. Alright, I have sewn my sleeve, and I've finished my edges by serging. So this is my sleeve. I've done both sides. All you gotta do now is take the back of your shirt at the side seam. So this is my back. This is the front. You can see it here with the facing. This is the side that has the pocket too. And you just want to line it up at the hem. You can see there. And up at the top, which is your sleeve hem actually. This shirt pattern I adjusted for my husband because I think I cut the small, but he's still a little smaller. So I have a little bit of excess off my sleeve is a little bit longer, but honestly I'm not worried about that. So I just usually cut it off. Or I could cut it off when I'm serging. It doesn't matter. What you want to do is make sure that your seams match each other at this point. Here, that seam where you stitched your sleeve on. So you want to make sure that it lines up. And now you just want to go and stitch 1/2 inch all the way down to the hem. You want to do that on both sides and finish your edges with your serger or your zigzag. You also want to, after you have sewn the seam, you want to go in and finish the edge of your sleeve hem, because this is going to turn up and straight stitch. So go to that, stitch your side seams together on both sides, finish your edges with your serger or your zigzag, and then finish the edges of your sleeve so that we can hem it. You can also hem the bottom, serge the bottom of your shirt, but I can show you that step also after I put my side seams together. Alright, sleeves are in, and I did go in and serge the edges of my sleeve. I just haven't hemmed it as yet. Side seams are sewn together. So all that we need to do now is go serge the bottom. What I usually do is I just go in and start serging from there all the way to the other end, and then I just turn it up 1/2 inch and give it a straight stitch. For the sleeves, it's already serged. I turn that up 1 inch and give it a straight stitch. If you have a pattern, make sure you follow your pattern. Like this has a pattern, so I have to try and make sure that I turn it on the pattern so that it doesn't look all weird. Last thing you want is you know, someone wearing your garment or you wearing your own garment and the pattern is off. Like your eyes get drawn to that immediately. So that's where at this point I will iron my side seams, and the next, after we hem it and hem the sleeves, the next step is buttons and buttonholes. Okay, everything is hemmed and ironed, and my last step is to get my buttonholes in place. Remember that notch we put at 3.5 inches? Well, this is where my first button is going to start. So remember I said we didn't want our flat stitch here to go all the way up to the top. I stopped it at the 3.5 inch point. It's because once you put your button here, if you had that stitch, it would show on this side. So that's why you want to stop your stitch. And you don't want to go too low because a lot of the chest is going to be exposed. So Now I'm going to put buttons, fine buttons, that will suit this shirt. My husband cut this shirt. He is better at figuring out the pattern matching than I am, so he did this. This really throws me off, trying to pattern match something to cut, especially in garments. It's quite easy for me in home decor stuff, but it's really difficult for me in garments. So I am going to look for buttons. I am going to make my buttonholes, and I will probably get him to put it on after and take a picture of him, because it will look better on him than on my female mannequins. I do not have male mannequins, so I will come back with the finished product. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe to my channel if you wish, and I will see you in the next video.